Good afternoon. This is Doug Holder, and I'm here with my guest on Poet to Poet, Christopher Busa. Let me just check this for a minute. Christopher is the founding editor of the Provincetown Arts magazine, okay? And he's also the founding editor of the Provincetown Press, a nonprofit publisher of the annual journal Provincetown Arts, monographs on. He also publishes monographs on distinguished older poets and first books of poetry by new poets. He's a native New Yorker, but he's spent a part of every year in Provincetown. He spent many years in Provincetown. His interviews and profiles of artists and writers have appeared in Arts, Garden Design, Paris Review, Mailer Review, and many other places. Over the past decade, he has taped hundreds of conversations with artists, performers, and writers and associated. And he's hosted the program Art Talk on WOMR FM 92. I think you said you created files for over 1,000 artists and writers in preparation for a comprehensive title about the century-long history of Provincetown arts.
Actually, that book is now 2 books. Each book is about 600 pages. Mm-hmm. So many of the memoir I'm writing is called Provincetown Arts, an mm-hmm. editor's memoir. And many of the pieces have been published already. And I'm going through and taking out redundancies so the book reads without a lot of repetitions and so on like that. But in a way, to talk about my motivation to start Provincetown Arts, I felt at a certain point, after 10 years in graduate school at Rutgers University, that I wanted to escape that brand of the PhD on my hide, which would make me feel almost diminished in some odd way. I grew up as the son of an artist who participated in the formative years of abstract expressionism, and he taught at many, many universities, but every time he'd go from one university to the next, there'd be a big brouhaha between the Studio Arts Department and the Art History Department. And so that there was a kind of a war between creative work and scholarly work. And I saw my father suffer, truly, even though he managed beautifully to, he was a very distinguished professor, and many of his students became top artists in the country, like Bill Jensen and Robert Haas and people like that. But I kind of escaped just after I did all my work for a PhD and then moved to Provincetown to start Provincetown Arts. This was in 1985. And we've been doing it now for 30 years. We've had all the major figures that populate Provincetown. I don't know if your audience understands that Provincetown is well known as the nation's oldest continuous art colony. It began in 1899.
Was it a fishing village at first?
Well, it was a beautiful fishing village, a lot like European fishing villages, and not unlike the end of the railroad places in France, Pont-Aven, and where all the artists from Paris would escape in the summer to go to the end of the railroad line and live cheaply in a beautiful environment. And Provincetown picked up that that impulse after the First World War, when a lot of the expatriates came back from Europe and said, how can we replace Europe? And then Provincetown became the place that reminded them of Europeans, and not only because half the population were Portuguese fishermen that had come over from the Azores and decided not to go back to the island, but just to load their fish in Provincetown. So there was always that kind of symbiotic relationship. And the fishermen would often, they would give fish to the artists who came down in the morning and needed fish to feed their families. So there's always this sense of a gift economy back and forth, and people managed to survive.
Yeah, I know. I read you talking about the gift commodity economy.
Yeah.
That's no longer around, is it?
Well, actually,
To the extent it was.
artists still barter. They will trade their dentist for dental work. They'll give them a painting. They'll find all sorts of this for that kind of arrangements. And I grew up watching my father do that routinely to pay bills, and I find it natural. The gift economy is, I take very seriously, because I don't know if you heard of a book by Lewis Hyde called The Gift.
Yeah.
It's a well-known book, and
Yeah.
it talks about how, like with the West Coast Indians, the circulation of wealth was, if someone does something nice for you, you blindly do something nice for someone else. You have these potlatches, and you try to display a sharing kind of thing. Instead of hoarding a certain amount of wealth for yourself, there's this constant flow of the wealth. And I see with artists, and I've seen this like with poets like Stanley Kunitz, who, you know, you don't get a lot of money for publishing a book of poems, but you do get prestige if you win a prize, you get a teaching job, and you find other sources that compensate for the lack of money.
But isn't it harder to be a quote-unquote bohemian now? I remember in the 70s I came up here and lived in the Back Bay in rooming houses and for cheap, and you know, there were communities, and it wasn't that expensive to live. Do you find that this is sort of disappeared, you know?
I always think that the life repeats itself, and what was difficult in the past is just as difficult now. It's just that the terms of its difficulty have changed. Artists kind of, my father used to say when he would get audited by the IRS and say, well, you're making all this money as a professor, and you're not selling that many paintings, and yet you're taking off so much in expenses for these art supplies. And they said, well, maybe we should call this art a hobby. And my father would say, oh, no. We have to change the way I file my taxes, and we're going to call it a disease, and I'll take a medical expense. Because the point is the role of necessity. Artists, whether they're poor or rich, seem to have a compulsion to do the work.
Isn't that true? I mean, if you're posturing, you're really not an artist, but you're actually compelled. I mean, you just really can't. I mean, you cannot. I mean, for better or worse, you just can't stop painting. You can't stop writing. There's something in you that must do
And
that.
I believe it has to do with the way artists use symbolism to have one thing replace another. Picasso said that when he ran out of red, he used blue. In other words, things could be used symbolically to represent what you don't have. One of the ways to distinguish an artist from a non-artist is talk about the way artists totalize. People that have their heads screwed on right can do work that they don't enjoy for the sake of earning a living, doing this and that, but then they'll have hobbies that they love. The artist totalizes. Everything that he or she wants to do is everything. So money becomes, it's like these artists that would paint dollar bills or $100 bills, go to a store and say, I'm a famous artist, here's the money, I made it. I want to buy this television and I want change in American dollars. So artists actually did that. So that it's this symbolic role that money has a value. I mean, an art product has a value, and it can be exchanged for goods. And it's a very amusing kind of idea, and it doesn't calculate very well with people that think art is useless. But if it's so useless, why do we crave it so much?
Right. There's a saying about that. Now it slips in my mind. Art is well, I can't remember. It was a great quote about art. But anyway, You know, you've you know, run this magazine for 30 years, since 1985, and you had a lot of great writers and artists who've been published in here. Maybe you can, you were just reading off a list of some of the folks that were published
I can,
or interviewed, or...
well, our cover subjects are tend to be like the prow of a boat, cutting through the themes for the whole issue. Here, a couple years ago, we had the writer Jhumpa Lahiri, who was a fellow at the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown years ago. She had gotten a PhD at Boston University. She got a fellowship to Provincetown. She had published 1 or 2 stories in a creative writing course she took at BU, and she got this 7-month fellowship. It was there that she wrote the stories in Interpreter of Maladies, which won the Pulitzer Prize.
So she got no, you published her also, or?
Well, I interviewed her.
You interviewed
yeah,
her?
And you know, we have some original work.
And so that sort of jump-started her in a way?
Well, no, she once she won the Pulitzer Prize, we seized on her as someone worthy of profound notice. But just to run through some of the issues that we published, Norman Mailer's been on the cover, Robert Motherwell, Annie Dillard, Joel Meyerowitz, Stanley Kunitz, the Fellows of the Fine Arts Work Center, which is this 7-month residency in Provincetown that brings in some of the top writers. 800 people apply for 10 spots in writing, and another 800 in visual art. And they've won every major award, from Bunting Fellowships to Pulitzer Prizes and National Book Awards that you can imagine. Mark Doty's been on the cover. The poet Mary Oliver has been on the cover. Karen Finley. John Waters, who's a filmmaker who lives in Provincetown, is now becoming quite a writer. Norman Mailer again. Eileen Miles. Alan Dugan. Sebastian Younger. Hayden Herrera, who's the biographer of Frida Kahlo.
Now, all these people have a connection with Provincetown?
Either they live down the block, or they live in Truro, or you know, they have deep roots there. So you know, Sebastian Younger is a good friend of mine. I see him every weekend at a club. Paul Resica has been in Truro for 30 years. Michael Cunningham was a Fine Arts Work Center. He lives down the block from me.
All these people you've interviewed?
In spades, you know, and not only that, I've grown and learned from them. Nick Flynn, another primary person.
Well, let me ask you this question. They say interview is an art, and tell me, how is it an art?
Well, I couldn't be more affirmative in a response. When I started Provincetown Arts, I began to realize that if we wanted to talk to really brilliant people, it was best to interview them so you got the voice of the genius and not watered down through a secondary intermediary. So and as son of an artist, I watched my father speak about painting, and I was astonished at the vividness of his paint could become anything. It could become air, laughter, crushed jewels. I thought, well, this is a fine way to talk about the transformative power of the medium of art. And then I thought that artist journals became a specialty of mine, and I was very influenced by Robert Motherwell, who was another neighbor, who published a series of...
He was at Harvard, wasn't he?
Well, he went to Harvard for a period, then he went to Columbia, but he was only here for a little bit. But Motherwell published a series of artists' writings called Documents of Modern Art. And he, like interviews with Marcel Duchamp, all kinds of the European modernists, and artist journals and interviews with artists became a way of isolating the artist's voice as a meaningful kind of discourse, as opposed to the art historian, who often would go through a whole series, almost like a biblical genealogy, who begat who begat who begat who, until you get to the present. But you've got to start with all these. But artists really jump over their father figures to a grandfather figure. They find.
So what's the role of the interviewer as to what?
The interviewer is like talking to the moon, and I see your face, but I don't. You don't see behind your face, and I can ask you questions about the dark side of the moon, and I can bring out elements that you couldn't express yourself. And I you know.
It's almost like a therapist.
That's not a far-fetched analogy, because I feel that as I'm an editor, my job, someone comes to me with a story, and they said, this story really moves me. I like many parts of it, but there's a chapter missing. One character is obscure when he should be more prominent. Can you help me make this story more coherent? And that's what you do with a therapist. You go and say, here's my life story. There's some flaws in it. And editing is really very similar to creating a sense of coherence for so the person can feel satisfied with the story he's told. I really think that what an artist wants is to find a result that he can accept. In other words, if I do this and you think it's good, but I don't think it's good, is it good? It's only good when I'm happy, when it satisfies me. And it's art for my sake, art for the artist's sake. And it reminds me of what Robert Motherwell said. He said, the only thing I have over any other artist is that I'm the only one that can paint Motherwells. So the idea is to become more yourself, not more like somebody else.
Now I want to, because you're going to have about 10 minutes to read from Stanley Kunit's book that you published, right?
Well, this is a book that was published by Sheep Meadow Press.
Oh, I know. Moss, the guy
by
Moss.
Stanley Moss, yeah. And it was a celebration when Stanley turned 80 years old.
But before we even go into this, I just wanted to, because I wanted to get this question. You have a memoir coming out.
Yes.
And I was particularly interested in your life and times with Norman Mailer. You said you knew since you were like 7 years old or something.
I did. Norman rented my father's studio after my father divorced my mother and took up residence in East Hampton, where there's a lot of artists as well. And I would watch Norman come in 5 or 6 summers. I'd be sitting on the porch, and he'd walk by wearing work clothes, a blue work shirt, around 10 o'clock, go into the studio, come out around 4, and he was like a house painter on a way to paint a house. And he really had a work ethic that was a profound influence on me. With all the stories about him running around and getting drunk and so on, that guy was a workaholic.
Was he a workaholic and alcoholic?
Well, I wouldn't call him an alcoholic, but I will relate a story that the common gossip in Provincetown was when you saw Norman in the evening, the time to talk to him was between his 7th and his 14th drink. You didn't want to catch him before he was relaxed.
But you know what? Like they said about Bukowski, if he was quite the drunk that he was, but he was very disciplined. I mean, he couldn't be drunk like he was all the time, like he was claiming. It was part of a shtick, I think, because he was very disciplined. He would be sending things out all the time and writing all the time, and yeah. I'm sure he wasn't a teetotaler, but perhaps it was a bit.
Well, I mean,
and Mailer Mailer was a very disciplined guy.
Well, he wrote 50 books,
right.
So you don't get those books written with, by wasting your time. But Mailer was interested in altered states of consciousness, and that writing could take him into other places. One of his books is called The Spooky Art, because of the power of the medium to alter how you think. And Mailer also experimented with marijuana. He wrote a book that's unpublished called Lipton's Journals. He called marijuana tea. Mm-hmm. I'm reading it right now from the Ransom Center in Texas.
He was also an amateur movie maker, wasn't he?
Well, he wouldn't call himself an amateur. He made Maidstone, Wild 90,
yeah.
And
I'm sorry. Norman, was he? Yeah, he was.
Well, and Tough Guys Don't Dance. Which
yeah, that's right. That was a major motion picture.
And that movie was the first issue of Provincetown Arts, when Norman was on our cover. He had just finished Tough Guys Don't Dance. And we quoted him on the cover as saying, "This is a town you could see yourself digging in and fighting for." And it was all became a mantra for me that Provincetown was worth protecting. It had, he called it the Wild West of the East. And he felt it was the freest town in America because all kinds of different types of people were allowed to coexist there. And so I was always enamored with Norman's sense of freedom and his liberation and so on. But, you know, another key person for me, you know, my book is concerned with people like Motherwell, Mailer, but also very important to me was Stanley Kunitz, who I did the Paris Review interview with. You know those interviews.
Yes.
Yeah. And that got me to go back to your question about interviewing. That really made me appreciate the form as an art form. And so I wrote this piece on the occasion of Stanley's 80th birthday.
And he lived to 100 something, didn't he?
He lived to be 100 years old.
Yeah.
You know, he quit smoking 40 years before he died. And that always made me feel there was hope for me. But I wrote about his garden, a poet in his garden, thinking that how does a poet garden? And so I'm going to read about 3 paragraphs in the middle of this thing. I'm going to talk a little about how he created the space to build his garden. Kunitz bought this house almost 30 years ago when the front yard was something less than a garden. It was a barren sand dune. A few wisps of witchgrass, but nothing more grew. The whole area, about 2,000 square feet, was unstable. Later, Kunitz would build the soil using his formula for perfection. 1/3 sand, 1/3 peat moss, 1/3 compost, plus plenty of seaweed and cordgrass collected off the sea bottom at low tide. But first he realized that the only solution for the steep grade of sand was to terrace it. Then everything fell into place. The garden became like a poem in stanzas, he said. Each terrace is a stanza, or perhaps a section of a poem. Poems are the production of artists, not engineers, so it is only to be expected that Kunitz, who labored for 2 summers to prepare the space, struggled like a lord of creation with formless matter. "Have you ever worked with live, dry, loose sand?" he asked. "It's like shoveling water." I move on. A lyric poet is concerned with ways to concentrate experience within a small space. Thus, when Kunitz speaks about the art of poetry, he speaks also about the aesthetic of his garden. I quote, "The work of the imagination is not only in achieving magnification of experience by enlarging it, but also in achieving intensification of experience by reducing it in scale so that it becomes like a microscopic field." Because Kunitz's garden is small, every inch of space is used. No part can look bare or unkept. Keats' desire to load every riff with ore comes to mind, he says. "I even move plants when they stop contributing. Often I pot them and replace them with others. Later I replant them, but temporarily they've lost their rental space." Kunitz inherited one scarecrow of a tree, a chokecherry that was afflicted with numerous ills. It was the only tree on his property. It stood pathetically in a low depression just beyond the boundary of the garden. He recalls, "The tree was ugly, it attracted bugs, it blocked my view." He wanted to chop it down, but did not want the stump. He recalled Martha Graham admonishing her students at Bennington, where Kunitz also taught. "Self-consciousness is ugly." The sad gesture in the scrawny, gnarled trunk suggested a Graham dance, Kunitz remembered, called the Lamentation. "What to do with the tree?" Kunitz says. "I thought I would transform it into something I loved." Somewhat astonished at the confident way he can sound cruel, he explains how he choked the choke cherry by training Baltic ivy to sheath it. He had pruned the branches. The gesture evolved into an oxymoron, Kunitz says, both an artifact and something organic. He calls this tree his lamentation tree. It is the first thing he looks at each morning, he says. The tree is charismatic because it embodies death. Like us, says Kunitz, it lives and dies at once. It enacts with upraised, amputated arms the image of the suffering it undergoes. This is a pervasive theme in Kunitz's poetry. A beached whale dying on the beach is magnificent when his parched skin becomes parchment for teenagers to carve their initials on. The whale becomes like us, disgraced and mortal. I'll read one short paragraph more. Like poetry, gardening can be a technique for enlarging the ego through modesty. A technique more and more apparent in modern life is for the artist to cease to be common, to share general concerns. Now he is becoming a specialist or a technician at an advanced level, really a machine for converting the life into poetry or fiction or painting. One is thinking, how am I going to make a little poem out of my knowledge of flowers? I reject that attitude. Kunitz believes that too many artists today have a tendency to distance themselves from ordinary experience, such as cooking, eating, gardening. When I was a child, growing up in Worcester, Massachusetts, where the woods had spongy paths and were still Indian haunted, I had a little garden. This because I wanted to. Nobody told me, do this, do that. I called my first garden a victory garden, though I was not yet old enough to know what that meant. I just thought, if anything grew, it was a victory.
So it's truly a garden of verse.
You know, he's writing poems when he's out gardening because he's thinking.
Where did he live? Right in Provincetown?
He had a garden, he had first a 100-acre farm in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Then he had a 15-acre garden in Connecticut, and then a quarter-acre garden in Provincetown. And that's this whole idea of condensing, the kind of condensation that happens in a poem, where powerful experience is reduced to 40 lines. It's amazing. I don't know if you know his poem, The Portrait.
Okay, I'm not offhand. I remember reading one about his father and his father's horrible death.
My father killed himself in a public park some months while I was waiting to be born. Yeah. His mother was pregnant with him. His father committed suicide by drinking carbonic acid, and the whole role of the father figure became a main thing in Kunitz's poetry.
Thank you for joining us on Poet to Poet, Writer to Writer.
Well, what a pleasure to be here. I wanted to tell you about my trip, but we don't have time.
I don't have time, but thank you.